There are mornings when the first thing you feel is disappointment. Nothing terrible happened overnight. You simply opened your eyes to the same life you were quietly hoping would have changed by now. The financial pressure is still there. The prayer still has no answer. The dream is taking longer than you thought it would. And before you've even said it out loud, something inside you asks, God, when is it going to be my turn? You feel guilty almost immediately, because you know God has been good to you. You know there are things in your life worth thanking Him for. You know somebody else is probably praying for something you already have, so you correct yourself. Stop complaining, be grateful, trust God, and then you reach for your phone. That is when you see, someone got the job, someone got engaged, someone is traveling somewhere you've dreamed of going, someone has finally achieved the thing you've been quietly praying about. And you are happy for her. You really are. But underneath that happiness is a thought you don't particularly like admitting. I wish that were me. You close the app because you don't want to compare. But something has already shifted. Your circumstances haven't changed, yet your own life suddenly feels a little smaller. Now you're thinking about your age, the time you think you've wasted, the decision you should have made differently, and the morning has barely begun. But your mind is already putting your entire life on trial. That kind of tiredness is difficult to explain, because nobody looking at you would necessarily say you're unhappy. You still have plans, you work, you laugh. You talk about the future as though you believe something good is coming, and you do believe it, most days. But waiting can do strange things to a person, especially when you keep watching other people receive what you are still asking God for. After a while, you start wondering whether you missed something. Maybe I haven't worked hard enough. Maybe I made too many mistakes. Maybe God is trying to teach me something and I still haven't learned it. And then there is the thought you usually push away before it finishes forming. Maybe this just isn't going to happen for me. You don't say that one aloud. It feels too close to giving up. So you respond the way ambitious women often do. You make another plan. You decide to work harder, become more focused, get serious. You keep trying to improve the woman you are because somewhere inside you is the suspicion that maybe the reason your life hasn't changed yet is you. Ambition can hide that fear very well. It can make self-rejection look like discipline. It can make anxiety look like planning. There is nothing wrong with wanting more from your life. You can want financial security, meaningful work, better health, stronger faith, and a future you're excited about. But something changes when every desire for growth becomes another reason to be disappointed in who you are today. You reach one goal and your mind immediately moves to the next. Something you once prayed desperately for becomes ordinary. And peace keeps getting pushed further into the future. When the career moves, when the relationship happens, when God answers that prayer, then you'll breathe. But the finish line keeps moving. At some point, you have to ask yourself something uncomfortable. What if you don't need to achieve more before you're allowed to have peace? What if you've become so focused on what hasn't happened yet that you're struggling to see what already has? I had to confront that in myself. There were mornings when I would wake up thinking almost immediately about what was missing, what needed fixing, what I needed God to change. And even my prayers had started sounding like lists. God, help me with this. Open that door. Change this situation. Please let this work. Then one morning I realized I had spent several minutes talking to God about everything I wanted Him to do, without thanking Him for anything He had already done. That bothered me, not because asking God for things is wrong. Scripture invites us to bring our needs to Him, but I began wondering when my relationship with God had become so focused on the next answer that I was barely noticing the answers I was already living inside. There are prayers you stop calling prayers once God answers them. They become your normal life. The opportunity becomes responsibility. The thing you once cried about becomes something you hardly think about anymore. Yesterday's miracle becomes today's ordinary. Maybe that's why gratitude requires memory. You have to remember what life felt like before. Remember the version of yourself who didn't know how she was going to survive that season. The woman who cried about something you can now speak about calmly. The woman who asked God for strength and didn't realize that strength would arrive through all the days she had to get up and keep going. Think about your own life. There may have been a person you thought you couldn't live without. You're still here. A season when you had no idea how you would make it financially. Somehow you did. A rejection that once felt like proof that you weren't good enough. It doesn't have the same power over you anymore. And there were doors you begged God to open that, with enough distance, you can now admit would have taken you somewhere you didn't belong. You have evidence of God's faithfulness. You may have simply become familiar with it. So one morning, instead of beginning with what I needed, I stayed still for a moment before touching my phone. And I said, "Lord, I'm grateful. That was all. Lord, I'm grateful. Thank you that I woke up. Thank you for the people I still have. Thank you for the prayers you answered. Thank you for what didn't work out. Thank you for what I still don't understand. Nothing dramatic happened. The unanswered prayer was still unanswered. But it was no longer the only truth. My life was unfinished, but it was not empty. That is what gratitude began teaching me. You can want your circumstances to change without acting as though nothing good exists until they do. You can have questions for God and still remember that you do not face those questions alone. Philippians tells us to bring our request to God with thanksgiving. I used to hear the request part very clearly. Tell God what you need. But thanksgiving changes the posture from which you ask. It reminds you who you're speaking to. The God you're asking about today's uncertainty is the same God who carried you through yesterday's, and Lamentations speaks of God's mercies being new every morning. I love that image because morning arrives before you've accomplished anything, before you've been productive, before you've proved yourself. Mercy is already there. You wake up receiving. Yet so many of us wake up measuring. How much can I accomplish? How quickly can I get ahead? And perhaps, before any of those questions, there should be another one. What have I already been given? That changed the way I treated my mornings. I created a little space between waking up and letting the entire world into my head. I call it my phone quarantine. The phone isn't the enemy. I simply realize that because somebody can reach me first thing in the morning doesn't mean they need immediate access to my mind. The email can wait. The message will still be there. Those first moments are part of my life too, and I had been giving them away without noticing. Before we continue, if this is the kind of conversation you've been needing, if you're trying to grow, become more disciplined and create a better life without losing your peace while you do it, subscribe to She Builds Within. Now let's continue. Once the noise became quieter, I found myself sitting with 3 questions. What am I grateful for today? What am I carrying that belongs in God's hands? And what genuinely deserves my attention today? That second question is important because you can spend enormous amounts of energy thinking about things you cannot control. You revisit the same problem as though enough thinking will eventually give you control over it. The truth is, there are things you need to work on, and there are things you need to place before God and admit, I cannot make this happen by force. Maybe your prayer tomorrow morning doesn't need to sound polished. Maybe it sounds like, God, I'm tired of waiting for this. I'm afraid it isn't going to happen. I keep comparing myself. I don't understand what you're doing. Part of me is grateful and part of me is disappointed. Help me hold both without losing my faith. God can handle an honest prayer. Scripture is full of people who brought him difficult questions. Faith has never required pretending you don't hurt, but disappointment doesn't have to become the lens through which you interpret your entire life. That is where gratitude becomes more than a pleasant morning habit. It becomes an anchor. It reminds you that this chapter is not the only evidence you have of God's faithfulness. And after you've surrendered what you cannot control, there is still responsibility. If your finances need attention, look at them honestly. If a skill needs developing, develop it. If there is an application you've been postponing because you're afraid of rejection, submit it. If you're praying for an opportunity you know you're not yet prepared for, start preparing. Gratitude should not make you passive. It should make you less desperate. You can work hard because you're stewarding what God gave you instead of working frantically because you're terrified everyone else is leaving you behind. That is the kind of ambition I'm learning to want. Peaceful ambition. For a long time, I thought peace and ambition were opposites. I thought ambitious people were supposed to be slightly dissatisfied all the time. But if dissatisfaction is the only thing motivating you, what happens when you succeed? There will always be something else available to chase. Another goal. A bigger opportunity. Another version of yourself. If peace is something you only allow yourself once there is nothing left to improve, you may spend your whole life postponing it. Maybe peace has to become part of how you build. You can work toward financial freedom and still enjoy the life happening around you. You can want a different future without using your current life as evidence that you failed. That isn't settling. It's understanding that you do not have to hate where you are in order to move forward. And some mornings, none of this will look beautiful. You'll pick up your phone before you remember. Those mornings count too. If all you have is 2 quiet minutes, use them. Say, "Lord, I'm grateful," and think of something you genuinely mean. Tell God what feels heaviest, then decide what deserves your attention today. That's enough to begin differently. There are women listening to this who are genuinely tired of waiting. You have prayed, you've worked, you've tried to stay positive, you've watched other people receive things you would love to have, and sometimes gratitude feels difficult because disappointment feels louder. You don't need to be ashamed of that, but disappointment also doesn't get to tell the whole story. Your life is more than the prayer that hasn't been answered yet. There is strength in you that did not exist 5 years ago. There are ordinary moments around you that you will one day miss. There are parts of this season that future you may look back on with tenderness and wish she had appreciated more. You are standing inside a version of your life you will never get to live exactly like this again. That doesn't mean you have to love everything about it. It means you are allowed to be present while it is happening. Maybe the woman you're becoming isn't simply the woman who finally gets everything she wants. Maybe she is the woman who knows how to want more without becoming blind to what she has. She can wait without assuming she has been forgotten. She can see another woman's blessing without turning it into evidence that God has passed her by. And when disappointment is real, she doesn't have to pretend otherwise. She can bring that disappointment to God and still find something true enough to say, "Lord, I'm grateful." Tomorrow morning you may wake up to the exact same circumstances. The answer may still not have come, but before you decide that nothing has changed, give yourself a moment. Let the phone stay where it is. Think of one prayer God has already answered, one thing you survived, one ordinary blessing you stopped noticing. Then bring him what is still heavy, and ask for the wisdom to handle what actually belongs in your hands today. You don't have to pretend you're not waiting, you don't have to stop wanting what you're praying for, and you don't have to make yourself smaller and call that contentment. Keep building, keep believing, but you do not have to hate your current life to prove you're serious about changing it. Maybe that's where peace begins. When what hasn't happened yet stops stealing your ability to recognize what is happening now. And if this message found you in a season where you are learning how to wait without losing yourself, leave one simple sentence in the comments. "Lord, I'm grateful." Don't type it because everything is perfect. Type it because it isn't. Because gratitude has the most meaning when it isn't pretending. It is being able to look at an unfinished life and still recognize the hand of God somewhere inside it. So tomorrow morning, before you ask God when it will finally be your turn, remember the places He has already met you. And then say it again. "Lord, I'm grateful."